6 dark eyes stared at the enormous screen in front of them, watching live as 3 pitch-black ships hovered a few hundred miles outside of Geroliton's atmosphere, slowly turning in place with a gravitational spin that would have crushed most people with its speed. Although the camera was focused right on them, their exact forms were excruciatingly hard to make out, as their strange colouring seemed to swallow up light, causing the massive vessels to appear more as shapes than as actual, discernible structures while they merged into the blackness of the void. However, even with that vagueness, one thing that was impossible to miss was just how much one of the 3 forms dwarfed the other 2 already massive ships. Had they been beasts, the enormous flagship would have been easily able to swallow up its accompaniment and still have room to spare. So large was the difference in scale. For such a small species to produce a ship moving at that scale, it would have been ridiculous if it wasn't so concerning. Even for Zadaitos, a vessel of that size would have already been able to qualify as a flying city, and humans took up not even a tenth of the space of one of them, generally. That wasn't even mentioning their ability, and even tendency, to live very closely together with each other. Among other things, it was what helped their population to become as massive as it was. Just how many of them would be within just that one ship? Atrocity class, they called it. The question was it an atrocity waiting to be committed? Or was its mere existence itself already an atrocity? The humans had given just a small demonstration of their individual power, back when she had first found herself confronted with one of those floating fortresses. Well, fortress probably wasn't the right word for it, though she wasn't sure if she could actually think of a more fitting one. But back then, just a small group of them had actually left the vessel as they had descended on her planet, and just that small group had been necessary. Of course, back then, she had been caught unawares. Had she figured what was happening, she could have put up way more of a resistance. Against a full defense, even a ship of that size was by no means an even match. She couldn't deny it. The humans had acted well to move quietly and hit hard when it mattered. And yet still, even for just an ultimately small-scale stealth mission, they had come bearing absolute insanity. To bring just a single wall down, they had utilized weaponized unstable hyperspace. World-breaking technology that was well recorded within the galaxy to have extinguished more than just one fledgling species on its way to develop faster-than-light travel before they could ever leave the cradle of their homeworld, reduced to a forcible entry tool. And as if that hadn't been enough, they then proceeded to leave the planet by injecting their shuttle into an extremely powerful hyperspace externally generated by the flagship down into the atmosphere. Though it was sort of amusing to think about that specific instance a bit more, since a single mistake during that maneuver would have been enough for most of her problems to solve themselves in a literal instant. Then again, as much as she would have loved to simply chalk it up to dumb luck and recklessness, it was highly unlikely that they would have both employed and pulled off such a stunt if there hadn't been an extensively tested protocol of some kind for it. Ultimately, it sort of seemed that the Deathworld primates have had a sort of kindred existence in the fickle nature of hyperspace, allowing them to employ it in ways that were quite near to only being explainable through the will favouring it itself. It was quite possible that the humans had seen one of its extended opportunities, and grasped it without even realising what they had done there. A rather unfortunate circumstance. It must be quite fun getting to name one of the war-class ships. A voice suddenly pulled her out of her thoughts. In an instant, Apogeonora Adoxiatuia, High Matriarch of the Zadaitos people, was back in her office, staring at the screens in front of her that still showed the enormous Deathworld ships gently hover after they had not moved from their position even a tiny bit. I'm sure the name is already taken, but I believe if I was to get to name one, I would call it 30-year. Turning her head, the High Matriarch tilted her vision down. As always, needing a moment to completely focus on the tiny figure, that had taken up a position right next to her. By now, her brain had gotten used to the rush of endorphins that the sight of the generally adorable-looking offworlders brought with it. The general appeal was still there, but by now she had enough contact with the troublesome species that the looks alone weren't enough to raise her mood whenever she laid eyes on them anymore.
"I'm assuming there was a joke there that I don't understand."
Tua replied to his words as she tilted her head at him further to really get the tiny person into her vision. Luckily, he was in fact small enough that she barely had to pay any attention to the two of her 4 tusks that were pointing downwards while she moved her head like that. With many other species, she would have had to be cautious to avoid accidentally hitting them with the natural weapons. However, the human's head was still far below the range of any danger as long as she kept standing. And even if he wasn't, he should have so easily been able to avoid her movement that he himself would be entirely to blame if she ever did accidentally bump him like that.
"But even if I did, I doubt I will be in the mood to laugh at it right now, Alexander."
The light-haired human nodded his small head, and as he so often did, he reached for the pendant around his neck to tightly close his fist around it. "Indeed, not exactly an amusing situation we find ourselves in here," he agreed, needing to tilt his head back quite far to look up at the screens that were on eye level for Tuya herself. Though I will admit there was a certain magnificence to knowing that such powers were set into motion due to one's own self. This must be what it feels like to stare up at one of God's messengers, feeling the true weight of something so far out of your own realm, paying attention to you, really makes you feel your own insignificance. Tua released a displeased trumpeting sound at his waxing. God's messengers? Insignificance? They were just large ships. Tua herself had many like them under her command. Even if they didn't pack quite the same firepower as those she saw before her, their own numbers were far from insignificant.
"I can understand respecting an opponent's power, but maybe you shouldn't admire them quite so much." She harshly criticized the small primate, which was usually enough to make him think twice about his words. However, today, it seemed like the man was feeling a bit bolder than he so often did, as he shook his head in denial of her admonishment. "You have to understand, of course I admire this." He then defended himself and took a step closer to the screens, forcing him to tilt his head back even more so he could keep his gaze on them. By now, his pale blue eyes were reflecting the electric lights above, as he gazed almost directly into them, hiding his black pupils behind the reflection, and causing the illusion that his eyes themselves were glowing from the inside of his head. "This is the accomplishment of my people, a true creation of our own making. Whether it is directed at me or not, it doesn't change its very nature of what it represents. On our world, on Earth, we are the pinnacle of creation, and what would prove it more than something like this? A mountain moving at our behest, carrying power that can only be surpassed by the Lord and his hosts themselves." Despite both her annoyance and the much larger problem she currently had to deal with, his words made Tua pause for a moment as she inspected the young guy's face. She couldn't make out any hint of deception or theatre. Quite the opposite. His face indeed showed the same pure, undiluted adoration that his words and tone also carried with them. "It is strange that you would get so excited about it,"
the High Matriarch commented, pulling back firmly on her annoyed and stressed tone, as she wondered if she would glean something useful about her current ally from this moment. So far, she had experienced him as someone who scorned much of the specific technology that differentiated his people from much of the rest of the universe. It was the very reason he had decided to ally with her and her cause in the first place. Even if their goals didn't entirely align in any way, that specific factor was what had brought him into this alliance, and so it was quite curious to see him act so entirely against it now. Of course, she couldn't just ask him outright about it, She would have to word it a little more refined.
Isn't encroaching on your god's powers a blasphemous act in your eyes?
As tended to be the case with him when he was approached for an angle of his beliefs, Alexander's enthusiasm remained entirely intact, as he turned his eyes away from the screens and beamed up at her. His smile wasn't a sign of happiness caused by her interest, as far as Tua could tell. Instead, it seemed to be entirely sourced from his own internal ardor, merely bubbling outside at the thought of getting to openly muse about it.
Nothing could ever encroach on the powers of the Lord, the blonde human stated categorically, and slowly shook his head, while allowing his eyes to almost close. Almost. He has given us domain over the world he created. He is ultimately what made these huge strides for us possible, by giving us his blessing to use what he gave us. Nothing we could ever accomplish would reach even a fraction of his greatness, but his great love for us still shows in the possibilities he provided to us to achieve heights much higher than where he originally made us from dust.
Tua lifted her trunk slightly, to rub it over one of her ears, as she listened to the young man's slightly rambling explanations. And although his beliefs packaged it into a character and gave it some new ideals and agency, there were certainly hints of an understanding of the will in what he said. It seemed that Earth had not been entirely blind to his actions across the eons.
You are saying you believe your god wanted you to build weapons such as this?
She still couldn't help but ask, as she glanced back at the life-ending ships gently spinning in space. Pitch-black engines of destruction, able to rain death like nearly nothing else in the galaxy. These were supposed to be a gift from the loving and benevolent god Alexander so often waxed about. Alexander chuckled slightly. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered, he said, in a way that sounded like a quote that was quite roughly translated from the human language it was originally written in. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. The High Matriarch once again tilted her head slightly. Although it wasn't really all that strange in the end, she was slightly fascinated that apparently the humans had found themselves an explanation for their own omnivorousness within their spiritual beliefs. Maybe that could also be a reason why they seemed so aggressively adamant about continuing their practices of consuming meat, even though their bodies were perfectly well adapted to live entirely herbivorous, if they had to.
A god that handed all his creation over to be ruled and lorded over by a single benefactor? She mumbled to herself, and once again took a longer look at the Atrocity-class warship that currently threw its shadow over one of the most prominent core worlds. It was ironic to think, really, that the person who believed that everything should fear and dread his people stood here, right next to her, while those who claimed to want harmony and peaceful coexistence were out there, riding megatons of death through the void. However, Alexander released a slight scoff and shook his head yet again, crossing his arms as much as that was possible, while still holding the talisman around his neck clutched in one hand. Not all creation, he corrected her. There is one thing noticeably absent from the Lord's deliverance unto us. He then sighed and followed Tua's gaze to the ship. Man is not a beast of the earth, nor a bird of the heavens. He does not creep the ground and is not a fish of the sea. The world was delivered unto us, but yet we were not given dominion over ourselves. Dominion over man is entirely that of God himself. He further explained his beliefs, with a conviction that sounded like he was ready to move mountains to defend that stance. Everything about us, be it life or death, will ultimately be a matter between ourselves and the Lord. Our actions are ours,
and his judgment is his.
Domain over everything but yourselves? The High Matriarch asked, with fascination in her voice. Such an odd concept to follow. Some people on some worlds did believe that even thinking beings did not truly have agency, and were just acting on mere stimuli, like petty beasts, or following some externally determined path. However, Tua believed this was the first time that she heard of a religious belief that stated that thinking beings to, in fact, have agency, that however also stated that they might not be allowed to make use of said agency, as it would infringe on the right of the one who truly had domain over them. When the will saw certain actions favourable, it extended opportunities. However, it could not act on its own. It was just a will, after all. It was always up to those with agency of their own to reach out and take what is offered them. Though, in a way, she still once again found a hint of the will in his words. After all, she now finally understood one thing that she had struggled to grasp, how exactly it fit into the human's beliefs for quite a while now.
I see. And I guess your lord's dominion over you would also include your bodies,
she supposed aloud, and lifted her split trunk up so it formed a Y shape, slightly pleased with herself to finally have made that piece of the puzzle fit. Alexander's previously elated gaze slowly shifted into more of a stern grimace as he nodded at her words. "I see you understand," he confirmed for her. For a moment, he tore his eyes away from both Tua and the screens to instead gaze down at his right arm, that was still clutching his necklace, his knuckles now slowly turning white as his emotions seemed to intensify. Tua even picked up on a faint note of the vague, irony smell of blood in the air, indicating that the young man had once again punctured his own palm with the sharp points of his religious symbol, which was a concerning habit of his. In his endless generosity, he has given us the right to rule over his creation as we please, with only a single exception. Infringing on it is such an incredible gesture of ungratefulness that I find it hard to put into words. It was hard to entirely agree with his reasoning. Tua was sure that if she dug just a bit deeper, she would find plenty of disagreeable things with that philosophy in no time. However, for the time being, that motivation was certainly agreeable, and enough.
Indeed,
the High Matriarch therefore concurred, and slowly nodded her large head, before reaching her trunk over to her desk, picking up a large clean piece of tissue paper, before handing it down to the human so he could tend to his wounded hand.
After all, a powerful god like yours wouldn't make mistakes in his creation.
Alexander took the tissue that almost may as well have been a blanket for him with a thankful nod, before finally letting go of his now slightly blood-stained religious symbol to wrap his hand up in part of the clean white paper, soon staining it with a slowly spreading red blotch. "Indeed, he doesn't," he confirmed with a long sigh, and let his head hang down. "He is quite unlike us mortals there. We have to live with our imperfections, and are doomed to endlessly fix our own mistakes." The High Matriarch released another mildly perturbed trumpeting sound, and briefly nodded her head again.
"Quite,"
she confirmed. However, it seemed that Alexander actually wasn't done, as he raised his gaze and his voice again as he stared up at her. "It was quite the gamble to let him go," he then said, keeping his words rather vague who exactly he was talking about, as he knew Tua would know fully well what he referred to. "One that I am sure you can agree didn't pay off." Alexander hadn't made it a secret that he had found it disagreeable that the High Matriarch offered no protest to the Miet soldiers, heading out in their audacious attempt to take revenge on James Aldwyn. It was likely that he was worried that they would spill information about his direct involvement after their capture. However, apart from that, it was unlikely much would come of it. After all, she had not exactly made it a habit to keep those ruffians in the loop about any of her own operations, and whatever claims they would make were quite easy to dismiss in the end. The statements were made under duress, or the humans and Miet had been colluding since the start. There were many more possibilities than that. It was far from a huge problem. Besides, it offered enticing new possibilities in the end.
I was tired of them mucking around in my mansion, she dismissively stated, making it very clear that she wasn't planning on greatly discussing this topic with the human right now. Besides, they had become far from useful, and if we started keeping them around against their will, they would have only started making trouble.
Alexander released an annoyed hissing scoff through his teeth. Well, every problem is an opportunity, I suppose, he replied in a mumble, before releasing a long, exhausted exhale, and using his non-injured hand to rub some hair out of his face. Given your demeanor, I suspect that the project you so love being vague about recently is coming along as you wanted. Tua lifted her trunk to her mouth, and gently rubbed the underside of her chin as she thought about that, while her ears flapped in their usual continuous motion.
Yes, indeed. Preparations are proceeding nicely, she confirmed, with a tone that was slightly satisfied. Obviously, those ships and the humans swarming the planet's facilities right now were a problem. But, like Alexander said, and as the will always provided, they were indeed an opportunity as well. An opportunity that the humans themselves seemed to not have discovered yet. And since installations have been finished, I do still expect the help of your ever-so-capable assistants down the line, once I am actually ready to fully reveal it to you.
Having by now fully bandaged up his hand with the tissue, Alexander glanced up at her, his eyes containing the briefest moment of a glare, before turning more amenable again. Alliances aren't generally made to keep secrets from your ally, he informed her in an admonishing way, though Tua waved him off with one end of her trunk.
As long as we can profit off each other's secrets, I see no problem. And given that your own little secret has been extremely useful to us so far, I expect you will be inclined to agree with me, she assured him, very unsubtly implying that she would not appreciate him being hypocritical about who got to keep secrets and who didn't. I assure you, you will benefit off of my secret in the very near future. Don't you worry.
Well, Alexander replied with yet another sigh, and lifted his gaze up to the screen for one last time. Let's hope it is as useful as you hope it will be. With that, he turned around and began to leave without a word of goodbye. Tua waited silently for a moment, staring at the hovering ships. Those ships that carried one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy, equipped with weaponry that would pose a threat to nearly anything in existence. Fear and dread, a weapon that only a god could surpass, at least in Alexander's opinion. So far, Tua herself had only gotten the smallest taste of the power it harbored, but it had been enough for her to take it more than just seriously. However, despite what some of their own beliefs may have said, humans weren't gods. They weren't the pinnacle of creation, and they didn't hold domain over everything else in existence. Whatever they made could be overcome. Whatever they built could be destroyed, and whatever they destroyed could be rebuilt. They were smart and inventive as primates, and they were tenacious and militant as high-class Deathworlders. A dangerous combination that lived out its potential through their warcraft technology, to be sure. But in the end, they were still just people. People who broke rules. People who didn't care about natural order. People who were reckless even with their own existence. But people nonetheless. Once she was sure that Alexander had well and truly left, Tua moved, slowly walking over to close the door of her office. After the massive lock clicked into place with a mild creaking from the enormous piece of wood, she then turned back to her screens, gesturing with both ends of her trunks to close up the current live feed, and instead open the terminal's communicative functions. After a brief moment of a connection being built, three faces appeared. One was very familiar. Dark brown and rimmed by short, sand-coloured hair, a mouth that slightly extended out with large teeth waiting underneath thinly puckered lips. Ferrimore looked tired. He hardly ever didn't look tired since his escape from the detention centre, but today it was especially noticeable. He stared into his camera with a mostly empty expression, breathing deeply as he waited for the conversation to begin without offering a greeting. A second video feed showed the ivory faceplate of a Qoivery with the species' typical large blue eyes. Warrant Officer HFY offered her species' version of a salute, as her many flexible arms lifted in an X shape and then gently touched the sides of the mask-like plate over her face, which resulted in something similar in form to a human 8 symbol. The third and last window showed a large face of dark greenish-grey skin, equipped with 6 eyes, 4 enormous tusks, and a split trunk that was missing half of one of its ends. Just beside his eyes, the man's face also carried a huge scar that ran along the entire side of it, moved on through a deep slit that basically split his right ear in two, and then disappeared out of sight. Tua knew that the old injury actually carried on all the way down the side of his body. "High Matriarch," the male humbly greeted her, in a voice that was a lot more restrained than even Tua was used to from the men of her species.
"Thank you for taking my call, Nafim Durafren,"
the High Matriarch greeted the man, before extending her greeting to the other two as well.
"And you as well, Ferrimore and HFY. Things have started to gain some serious momentum rather spontaneously, as I am sure you are all well aware. Please report the progress of your respective tasks."
"My ships are moving into position as we speak," Nafmir Durafren replied, in an extensively respectful tone that was so unlike any of the other candidates for the title he strove for that it was almost uncanny. "Additionally, I have finished all the documents that you requested of me, and saved them securely in our systems. Preliminary tests also continue to look promising, my High Matriarch."
Tua nodded.
"Very good,"
she said, and immediately shifted her attention over to the other two. HFY was the first to speak up.
"With the aid of Alexander's diversion, I managed to install everything you asked for without being noticed, ma'am,"
the warrant officer reported, keeping up her salute for a moment longer before slowly sinking her arms down.
"Of course, we can only hope that the humans will not realize what they are looking for while searching through the facility." "Good work,"
Tua confirmed. It certainly was handy to have a Qoivery ready to deploy in the current situation.
"Alexander is also getting ready, even if he doesn't quite know for what yet."
That just left one, and she quickly directed her attention towards the last screen. Although, uncharacteristically, the captain remained silent.
"Ferrimore?"
the High Matriarch asked slowly, wondering if maybe the camera just didn't convey it well that she was looking at him. Seeming to briefly snap out of some sort of trance, Uton slowly lifted one of his hands and began to grab at the short fur around his neck.
I've worked out a plan for the engagement like you asked me to. If things play out as you expect, they should provide the intended result," he explained, with exhaustion and clear hesitancy in his voice.
Tua lifted her trunk slightly.
"Thank you, Ferrimore, but are you all right?"
she wondered, feeling a bit uneasy about seeing her old friend and confidant in such a state, especially after he had finished such an important task. Uton exhaled deeply and looked directly at her through the screen.
"Are you sure about this, Apogeonora?" he asked, as his dark eyes bore into hers with his empty gaze. "Even after everything, this is so drastic."
Tua released a harsh breath through her trunk.
"Things were drastic when my mate was killed on my doorstep,"
she said, leaving no uncertainty of her actions in her voice.
"It is about time we truly show that those abnormalities are not allowed to run the galaxy into the ground as they wish."
Uton lowered his gaze slowly,
and released a heavy breath. "Well, you'll have your plans," he said as he gazed at the ground. "Success to you." With that, his feed suddenly cut off, leaving the High Matriarch to sigh in mild worry. "Such a pitiful display of self-loathing," Nafmir dual friend lamented quietly, and shook his head.
"Indeed, it is sad to see the captain like that,"
Haifati concurred with the male's statement, and also shifted her shoulders a bit.
"He was a great man once."
Tua closed her eyes for a second before shaking her head.
"Let it be a lesson to all of us about investing our time and love into the wrong people,"
she surmised, before moving to end the call completely after getting the update she needed.
"Success to you."
Around the same time, Alexander had arrived in a large room on the other side of the mansion, having taken quite some time to traverse the massive building. The room itself was hardly even a room. It was really more of a glorified freezer, though right now the temperature on the inside was still easily within the double digits, even as Alexander could hear the room's cooling system working. He didn't pay it any mind as he approached a man sitting in the relative middle of the room. In accordance to his usually cold surroundings, he was packed thickly into a dense jacket and had most of his face covered with a thick scarf. Before him was a small screen and keyboard, both cheaply bought and of mediocre make. However, they didn't matter for what they were used for, because if one followed them with their eyes, then the subpar setup was connected to a quite massive piece of hardware that, for the uninitiated like Alexander admittedly was himself, looked like a cobbled-together mess of chips, wires, circuit boards, and all kinds of other parts that were more loosely than rightly held together by a patchwork of metal frames that were attached to give structure wherever they could fit without interfering with the system's functions. "It's a good thing they haven't had the Realize check the systems yet. Pretty sure the real deal would find me no problem," the man chuckled as he sat hunched over, leaning closely to the screen. Obviously he had heard Alexander approach. Alexander inspected the mess around him briefly before he sighed. "Try not to be caught. We can't afford to have to face that thing head on," he then told the man, who quickly laughed. "Don't have to tell me. I don't want to lose my baby," the man confirmed and petted the screen. Then he glanced back. "So, did she tell you?" Alexander sighed and slowly shook his head. "No, but I'm sure you will," he then replied after a moment, and began to slowly sit down next to the man. "So, let's hear it. Do you think whatever she has planned there is going to be useful?" The man chuckled and reached up to pull the scarf over his face down, revealing a pair of extremely dry and cracked lips that threatened to burst open with each word that he spoke. "Guide page. It's certainly going to be a spectacle," he said with a wide grin that caused a few droplets of red liquid to slowly trickle down into his mouth.